We're just going to wait like 30 seconds to let folks trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, why don't we just get started? Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Shani from Greenlight, and I'm thrilled to host tonight's event with Billy-Ray Belcourt presenting his new book, A Minor Chorus. He'll be talking with Jaye Simpson, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Billy-Ray, Jay, and the team at W.W. Norton for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons, and we'll only be pulling questions from the Q&A to be answered in the latter part of the program. Importantly, tonight's featured book, A Minor Chorus, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person or order online at greenlightbookstore.com. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat. And as a thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon Greenlight Events 10 into the coupon discount section at checkout for 10% off. So on to our two folks here. Jaye Simpson is an OG Cree Soto Indigiqueer from the Sapatawayak Cree Nation. Simpson is a writer, advocate, and activist sharing their knowledge and lived experiences in the hope of creating utopia. She's published in several magazines, including Poetry is Dead, This Magazine, Prism International, Sad Magazine Green, Guts Magazine, Subterrane, Grain and Room. They are in 4 anthologies: Hustling Verse, Love After the End, The Care We Dream Of, and Queer Little Nightmares. Their first poetry collection, It Was Never Going to Be Okay, was shortlisted for the 2021 Relit Award and the 2021 Dane Ogilvie Prize finalist, while also winning the 2021 Indigenous Voices Award for published poetry in English. She's a displaced Indigenous person resisting and ruminating and residing on Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nation territories, colonially known as Vancouver. They'll be speaking with our featured author, Billy-Ray Belcourt. Belcourt is a writer from the Driftpile Cree Nation. He's an assistant professor in the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia and the author of 3 books of poetry and nonfiction. He lives in Vancouver. Billy-Ray's new book, A Minor Chorus, is his debut novel. After an unnamed narrator abandons his unfinished thesis, he returns to northern Alberta in search of what eludes him. What Ensues is a series of connections and disconnections that reveal the texture of life in a town literature has left unexplored, where the friction between possibility and constraint provides an insistent background score. Billy-Ray is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then I'll be talking with Jay and with all of you. So please take it away, Billy Jay.
Thank you. Shout out to Greenlight. Shout out to the folks at W.W. Norton. And shout out to Jay for being here. I'm going to read from the start of chapter 2, which is called A Gust of Life. On dating apps, I sometimes asked men to describe the texture of their grief. If I wasn't immediately blocked, most spouted platitudes or said something like, "Are you looking or not?" Those who did make it to my door were brief, nameless, untalkative. Usually they wanted me to be a room they could govern the limits of, paint a new shade of blue, hungry topaz, hungry sapphire. I developed the habit of hooking up with men after long evenings of working on my dissertation, of writing into the void, hurling myself at myself. For a while, this felt like an extension of my work, mostly because my sadness and horniness had become inextricably entangled. Perhaps unsurprisingly, neither what I wrote nor whom I met at all hours of the night made me feel much else other than dim and indistinct. What I wanted from sex, I wanted from writing, to be more fully inside my body without encumbrance, to experience embodiment as something other than a catch-22. My body felt so thoroughly overdetermined by forces outside of me, yet it was the source of my livability. It literally coursed with life, even as life was something I was being deprived of. Love, art, these were small portals. They allowed for transcendence. Maybe there was a kind of danger in how ravenous I was for that which placed me beside the present. It was too late in the day to fully pursue this epiphany to its logical end, so I opened Grindr. I ended up messaging with a therapist. He'd heard of me, seen me around campus, which terrified me, ruptured the allure of anonymity. I was less interested in having sex with him and more interested in his knowledge, which I suppose is also a kind of eroticism. He asked me to send another photo to be sure I was who I said I was. I sent him a candid photo River had taken one afternoon at a campground about an hour east of the city. In it, you could see the tattoos on my knuckles, which spelled out my username, Cree Homo. In my early 20-something mind, the act was an homage to Roland Barthes' famous declaration that language is a kind of skin. I interpreted the aphorism literally, wanted to turn my body into a book of sad poems. I convinced myself that the tattoo would amount to a small refusal of the way its colonial systems demanded my invisibility. I hadn't yet understood that visibility begot its own kind of endangerment. He told me that the tattoo was sexy, that I was handsome, and sometimes that was all it took to win me over. So when he asked if he could come over, I said yes. On my couch, surrounded by wobbly towers of books about loneliness and state-sanctioned oppression, we talked for an hour about how I thought the body was a human invention, a ruse, a story that's easy to digest. I told him about how it had been easy to pretend the sounds of the brutal earth weren't mounting to a crescendo around me. I didn't care if my woundedness was unsexy. All of this was ugly work. Surprisingly, he wasn't turned off by my honesty. In fact, it aroused him, made him feel like he was someone I could empty onto. He experienced it as an intensity, a gravity pulling at him. It was late, and I was lonely, and I was in rehearsal for another kind of life. So I drew the blinds and unbuttoned his jeans. It was all over in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Billy-Ray. I remember when you were first working on this story years ago and hearing some of the renditions and the way it's moved has been such a gorgeous witnessing. And it's so fun to see her just out and about. It's so great. Um, so I found when I read this collection, um, there was this beautiful marrying of poetic lyricism and the realities of Northern Alberta.
Mhm.
Uh, did you want to talk about what that was like to fuse those different forms? But then also, it's very genre defying, and that's
Mhm.
something that's so intriguing in your very first novel.
Mhm. I think what's interesting to me is the way that the term lyric modifies the novel. So the book has often been described as a lyric novel. And that gave me pause because I think it implies that novels aren't meant to be lyrical, or that the conventional novel isn't lyrical. It
Mm,
never occurred to me not to write a quote unquote lyrical novel. I
mm,
think that the lives of the people in Northern Alberta are worthy of a lyric. Um, and because I'm a poet before I'm anything else, of course, my sentences are going to have the intensity of a poem. But as I was working on the book, especially its first draft, I kept feeling the pressure of the novel form bearing down on me because I was at a distance from its conventions. And of course, I compromised in some ways because I still wanted to write a novel. But it also occurred to me that the book had to be about what it meant to be at a remove from the conventions of the novel, because I think that there's some kind of relationship between the fact that the lives of the characters I wrote about in a place like Northern Alberta do not get written about. And I think that, coming from this poetic vantage point allowed me to see the beauty and philosophical resonances in their lives.
Thank you for that. I found while reading this collection that the lyricism of it and the grace that gives the participants in this story, it gives them a more honest conduit, and I think that's something that um, there hasn't been a lot of room made for. So I found this collection, this story, to be so gorgeously devastating at times, because the content in which you write about frightened me. And I remember I was texting you on the plane, and I was just like, I had to put this book down and sob, and the flight attendant asked if I was okay. Um, but it was because you did not shy away from some of the harder conversations that we as Indigenous people know and we bring up and we process, but you did it in a way that kept, like, I still felt very safe while witnessing this collection. But it what this novel does, I think, that's very interesting, is it's not a window but rather a door to a conversation for
Mhm.
non-Indigenous readers, but also very specifically folks who are unfamiliar with Northern Alberta. Um, Tell me what that process was like, and how it differs from being a window compared to a door. Like, it's a
Mhm.
door.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the conceits of the novel is that the vast majority of the difficult and traumatic things that happen in the past tense. So the characters that are being interviewed are reflecting on events that have already happened, which means that what matters most to the narrative, or the sort of the narrative momentum, is the fact of their having survived, so their capacity to survive. I think that shifts what can be desired from a book, from an Indigenous book in particular. Because as we know, certain readers bring certain expectations to consuming our literature, which I was incredibly aware of, having already written 3 books. So that changed how I presented these characters, the kinds of frames I situated them in, where, as you say, something, that where grace matters, and um, feeling safe or held in the face of difficult material matters.
Thank you. When I was reading this, I had to go back and find a highlighter because there were so many parts in which I wanted to just like freeze in my brain forever. And part of it was that you thread together these stories um, with these just delicious things that just like take my breath away. Um, in in chapter 3, you nearly end it. Suddenly, I become the family's writer, and in this, it's historian, it's coroner. And it got me thinking about how, as storytellers and as with that responsibility, it's not just telling a story out of joy, but rather
Hmm.
in our archival process. And we are now in a situation, generationally, where we, as the archivists of our, is that the right word? Um, of our stories and our families and the stories we choose to tell, we have a responsibility to be honest about that.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and when writing about Northern Alberta, there is a lot of honesty, but then also, um, it's a novel.
Hmm.
So, how did you balance that?
Hmm. I like this question because it doesn't presume. I mean, and you know about this frustration that the novel is about actual people. The people in the novel are people I invented. The things that happen to them are imagined, but they're imagined, I hope, in a way that is still resonant with real life. So I'm a realist, I suppose. I think that realism is the genre of the politically depressed. Partly because we can't stand the present, but so we write about it. Um, anyways, I I because I'm a person who is in the world, I know about certain things that happen to people in Northern Alberta. I come from Northern Alberta. I grew up there. Certain things happened to me, and I thought, especially in the wake of writing my memoir, I thought, well, I'm only sort of glimpsing part of the story because I can only talk about myself. And with the novel, the ability to imagine, I could attend to these larger social and political and economic problems, um, without having to center myself. So in like the in very my very early conception of the novel, I didn't want the narrator to be much of a focus. I just wanted him to merely be like the person that is recording or transcribing or synthesizing discussion. I think that gets at my core intention with this book, uh, which was to record something that feels real, not simply for the sake of recording it, but with the hope of generating conversation about how, though history very much sculpts us and creates us, there's still the possibility to be and to live differently.
Mhm. Thank you. I enjoyed the convert. Like, I really enjoyed that answer and the like writing about realness, but then also it not be like, it's something that I find myself doing also, and a lot of folks are like, oh, is that a self insert? Like, sometimes people can have shared identities and experiences and it not be an autobiography. Like,
Yeah.
it's not about me. It's But also, if you feel like the situation is about you, maybe it's because you did something like it, and maybe it's simply a metaphor.
Right. I think there's something interesting there about the way that the readers reinvent the context of the work, for better and for worse.
Well, we get it as poets, like, is this about me? And it's like, I always say, if the shoe fits, you've worn it, you know?
Very that.
Very that. This um this novel had taken quite a big um chunk of my mental space over this summer. Being able to preemptively read it was, while there was still so much sun, was very important for me. Um, but there was, a conversation on an experience with a white woman in this novel that had me very concerned, and it brought up some of the patterns of feeling that I felt with Colton Bushi. And there was a very substantial fear that I had while reading this collection. But the way you've written about it and the way that you've moved through it was very real, but also important. But one of the things that I found to be exceptionally interesting in the craft of the novel in this situation that really piqued my interest even more was the lack of quotation marks in dialogue. And it felt so much more uncomfortably intimate in that moment. Was there a specific reason on the lack of quotation marks?
I suppose I had been influenced by a number of writers who don't use quotation marks, like Sally Rooney. But I landed on that choice after receiving some edits from an editor over at Hazlitt. They published an early version of the chapter called People Were Crying. And the editor there, Haley Cullingham, she said something to the effect of, these characters are speaking to each other in very philosophical ways. And I'm not sure that that feels realistic, which, it isn't. And so I thought, well, what could I do to modify the flow of dialogue in a way that suggests that sometimes what's being said isn't always directly what's said, but sort of reframing on the part of the narrator. I think maybe I bit off too much in making that decision, but I wanted room to be able for the narrator protagonist to be able to theorize about what's being said in order to draw out emotional and thematic importance.
I think it really worked. It got me thinking. It got me crying. But I found it solidified the perspective of the narrator. It really was in how that it's through the eyes and the experience, and it wasn't some omnipotent overseer, which I think was very important in the perspective. This collection, I'm saying the word collection, and that's just the wrong word. This collection. The novel and the protagonist constantly navigate body and what it means to be a body, specifically in Northern Alberta, especially with the interviews. And it's something that the narrator goes through in this conversation and the musings on it. And I think what that moved in me was the reality that every person that was interviewed and these conversations and dialogues are so important on navigating and having a conversation on the ecosystem that is Northern Alberta. Were there any parts that you didn't include or any interviewees that didn't make the cut?
I'll just say quickly about the thing about the body as one of the novel's concerns. About halfway through the book, there's an interlude called Art. And in it, I say, I write, let's say I'm fictitious in the way reality is fictitious. Let's say I have to be unendingly invented and reinvented. let's say I believe in myself the way a good citizen believes in the goodness of his country. Let's say that's a lie. Let's say I can't be a beautiful sentence unto myself. Let's say I hate this about myself. There's just something there about, I think I wrote in another poem, I wish I was, or confession, I want to be a poem more than I want to be a poet. This, I don't know, this is just the messy materiality of the body that is difficult and depressing, but of course also the condition for so much joy and intimacy. But anyways, about in response to the other question, because the book's so short, no one sort of was eclipsed from it. So everyone I imagined stayed in the novel through the various drafts. And in fact, at sort of the last hour, I decided to say a bit more about the mother, because I don't think this is a spoiler, but she's the one character in the novel who says very little, and that an interview doesn't actually take place. And it occurred to me that, not to overly psychoanalyze the protagonist or my own art, but that there's something about the protagonist's inability to have a conversation with his mother that made him want to write a novel. I think, in a way, a novel is how we stage certain conversations that we aren't able to have, in the same way that poems can as well.
Well, you wrote what I think I want to see. Like, what I want is to see her in her totality. I want to know her side of the story without feeling personally implicated. And that, I think, was so fantastic, because you touch on so much without a dialogue, without a conversation, without that, that. And I think the narrator navigating that, and the complexity of that, was such an important nuance compared to the other interviewees, where there is a dialogue, there is a back and forth, and then there's a conversation where the interviewee leaves with something also. But then this part was, I did have a really good cry about it because of my own relationship with my mother. But the way that it's all woven together gave me an opportunity to witness a landscape that I am so unaware of. And part of it is the colonial conversation of Alberta and Northern Alberta is marred by this idea of it being a wasteland of sorts. And this collection is such a subversion of that narrative, in such a dazzling display of unapologetic knowing and witnessing. And part of that is the chapter on the powwow grounds. And I remember I got the opportunity to cry with joy when reading that chapter. And I think that's something that the novel does so beautifully, is capture these moments of joy, and they don't feel stolen. They feel rightfully deserved, and there if you choose to see it. Do you want to talk about
it? Yeah, I liked writing that chapter that said at the powwow on the reserve, because my intention was precisely to do that, was to represent a Native mother's joy and let it exist as such. And I was thinking about my own aunt and how good of a mom she is, and how I know so many Native moms like that. And I was like, so that kind of mother needs to be in the novel too. And I don't think, again, it's not, I don't think it's a spoiler. There's not really much spoilers to this book, but she also is, she's raising her two kids, and one of them is likely queer. And I just wanted to say, it can be so simple, raising a queer kid. And I wanted uh, Lena is her name, to talk about her, queer kid without any kind of emotional compromise being expressed.
Thank you for that. It was so important for me to witness, and I think it was something that was so breathtaking, and and it's something I've spoken to you about too, but how I seek queer Indigenous joy, especially in the formative way and the support, and
Mhm.
to see an adult be like, I want the world for them to say that, to put that breath into that fire and into that life. Was I'm getting a little watery eyed about it, but I think that was something that was so important, um, and very refreshing in just the literary canon, in the writing. But what I also found, um, very compelling about this novel was that it's an entire dialogue. It's a conversation unfolding around us, and held between it all is the interview with the brother. And that conversation I found to be so enthralling, specifically because I got to experience you read, um, uh, the short story version of the phone call with the grandmother.
Mhm.
And so seeing that ebb and flow and that, creation story in this novel was particularly, aching. Um, did you like, what was that like? I'm unsure if I would be able to do that without kind of breaking.
Yeah, well, the first time I read that story was the instance you're talking about, which is on Zoom in I 2021, early 2021, and my voice did break a bunch, and again, it's because I know the urgency of those characters' stories. I know that they're material, they're not just fantastical. And those two characters are really, their stories represent the way that ordinary Native people are constantly fighting for their lives, which is emotional. And it, a lot of Native people resonate. I know will resonate with their stories, especially those with the sort of connections to a reserve. But it occurred to me in later drafts that the cousin Jack, um, his life would structure the plot, and I wanted to do that because and I think there actually is a bit that can be spoiled, so I'm not going to. But I think he represents for me an experience of sort of intense subjugation, though it does not get understood as such. I think one of the kernels of interest that led to my writing this book was my noticing how people in Northern Alberta, myself included, are so determined by history, yet there are so few opportunities to discuss that fact, or to even begin to know that fact and to understand oneself as a subject of history and of politics. And so I thought, what could happen if people could have that conversation? And that led to the book.
It's a pretty iconic book, in my opinion. I'm running out of questions because you're very good at this. And I realized I probably should have had 20 on hand.
If folks have questions, please let us know in the Q&A box.
We're really great at volleying. We really are. The iconic, I do have to. One of the things that I found absolutely like to throw some physical comedy in there is you have some poems in here, and they're very intentional.
Yeah.
You mentioned one as like the Art Interlude. To me, that was very poetic because it was just like
Yeah.
The way it flowed, it just felt like boom, 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 and I feel like I could listen to that forever. But I don't want to spoil too much because like the first interaction of like a poem that we get is so it's so good, and I was like, of course that this would be the poem, and I think that is such masterful craft. Like, was that uh, like I what made you think of doing that specifically for that scene and that?
Yeah.
Because I was there being like,
I will say that I wanted to write it in a single sentence, that scene, because it made sense to me that some human experiences, that some human interactions, however long they are, feel like a single sentence. But I ended up adding punctuation just to appease some of my editors' queries. But I guess I felt empowered by other poet novelists like Ocean Vuong, and there's a note in the acknowledgments of his novel where he thanks Ben Lerner for reminding him that conventions are not axioms. They're simply people repeated them enough where they felt like they became rules, but we can break them. And so essentially I'm breaking the form of the novel with those moments. And because I know that a novel is capacious enough of a form to accommodate other genres and other kinds of language.
oh, that was amazing. I found it to be like a dance. Like the way that this moved was very interpretive to the movement of the environment, but the way it moved was so natural. And so I found it to be, when I turned the page and saw it, I was like, here we go. And the movement was fantastic. And I was just like, I think what that does is it provides a callback to some of your work previously, but the nature in which the movement of the dance of this poem and this scene is quite different, um, in my opinion. But
Mhm.
what it what I find that it does is it reaffirms the participation of sexuality in this environment, and that
Mhm.
um it like the narrator's sexuality doesn't have to be a thing that happens to the narrator, but something that the narrator like participates in relationship to the environment, and that it
Mhm.
can happen and does happen. And so I found that to be a very particular nuance that was very important to me.
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe you want to say something to that.
You're like, help me out here. Um, that actually, that chapter, the hotel scene that inspired the cover, and I'll just say that I really wanted a man's butt somewhere on the cover, but because of the things that should be that you should expect, um, that was not possible. But so when you think of this cover, think of a man's butt also. But that, yeah, so that hotel scene was actually inspired by, so in this case there was something that happened in my own life that inspired that scene, where I was, you know, staying with my sister and, you know, back up in northern Alberta, and met up with a guy from Grinder. He was staying at a hotel. We but sort of, there was just so much constraint that nothing was possible. So, you know, he didn't want to be seen. I also didn't want to be seen. Um, we couldn't talk to each other really, and so yeah, so that's what I was drawing on that. But instead of nothing happening, I wanted in the book something to happen.
Mm. Ooh, thank you.
So that's a little behind the scenes bit of tea.
I do remember you telling me that. I also remember the journey and when you first showed me the cover, and I was like, I would love this cover, but like maybe they're a mirror and we can see into the bathroom. And then we're having those conversations, and you were like, I would like a
We're also not like graphic designers, so
no. The
um,
graphic designers hate these writers.
a BuzzFeed list.
I find I love I love this, but I also love this. Big, huge fan. Um, as I'm wrapping up my questions, I do want to reiterate that if any participants want to ask any questions, there's the little Q&A speech bubble, um, because we have about 15 minutes left, and so that's what I want to reiterate. Um, but in the meantime, I do want to say that the book is available to be ordered. And if you go to the chat, that there is a link in there to purchase it, and it's an event special link. And if you use the code Greenlight Events 10, you can get 10% off. And so I highly suggest you order it. It's fantastic. I'm a huge fan. I have many copies, many copies, and many different editions.
Yeah, thank you for doing this, Jay. And we can always wrap up a little early and enjoy our go out and enjoy our evenings.
True, true, true. I just want to invite any of the participants. It's fun, it's chill. We could also wrap up early.
Questions, comments, compliments.
Compliments work. We'll take compliments. Yeah, we'll take them. Huge fan. If not, going once, going twice. I know some people are typing. Some people are probably listening while living their life. Um, but maybe a great question that I have is, what's next? Oh,
Um,
do you have a
so
question?
I'm working on some short stories as well as poems.
Mm,
And
so thrilling.
the one of the short stories is about one of the characters in the novel. So that's a little teaser,
I
people.
love that. Oh my God, can't wait. So we have a question.
Ooh.
Maybe we'll use this as our ending early question, our final question. How does it feel having this out in the world versus your memoir? Oh, we also have a
Um,
question, so we'll end with that one.
so I remember like the week before my memoir came out in 2020, in the middle of our collective lockdown. I was like, oh God, everyone's gonna know about very, intimate details of my life. And that felt anxiety inducing. But with the novel, I similarly felt a surge of anxiety because, there's that old cliche that, nothing in a novel is ever untrue, that it all sort of reflects something about the writer. And I was like, so people are going to know a lot about me from the novel, even though it's fictional.
Mm,
And so anxiety at the end of the day.
mm. Thank you. So we've got two questions, and we'll use them to wrap up. Um, the first one is from um, Aspen. How do you both handle being so talented and gorgeous? Come on, Billy Ray, tell us.
It's hard work. A lot of sleep.
Oh, yeah, true, true, true. You get more sleep than I do. I do it all out of spite. Yeah, that's how I do it. We have a question. It's true. We have a question from Ian. What I really want to ask is, how does it feel for the two of you to be next to each other on the Massey staircase? Um, I'm not gonna lie, that's fun. There's the two-part question. How does that feel, Billy Ray?
I'll just say there's a bookstore in Vancouver called Massey Books, Indigenous owned and operated. Shout out Patricia Massey. There's a staircase in the bookstore, and she installed a number of book spines on it, and it's chronological. So Jay and I's books are right beside each other, and it's iconic.
We're also besties, so we have photos with it together. So it's just, when it's right, it's right. But here's another one. How has the book been moving through the world so far? Any difference in reception in Canada versus the US? Is it being published farther afield? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Interestingly, more reviews of the book in the US than in Canada. I think that says something about Canadian literary culture, but we don't have to get into that. um, I've been impressed with the intelligence and generosity that a lot of people have met the book with. It's not an easy book, both in terms of how it's written and what it's about. And I feel like a lot of people have opened up a lot of space for it, and that really feels like a miracle sometimes.
Mm.
And it'll be interesting to see how it continues to be taken up in both countries. And it'll be out in Australia and New Zealand in 2023.
Mm. Yay! Thank you so much, Belcourt. Thank you so much also to Greenlight Bookstore, and thank you everyone for participating this evening. Greenlight Bookstore is now back.
I'm back. Jay, thank you so much for being a great interviewer, and Billy-Ray for being a great interviewee. This was a great conversation. Everyone, please pick up a minor chorus at greenlightbookstore.com. Make sure to use Greenlight Events 10 for 10% off. And thanks everyone for coming. Have a great night. Right. Bye everyone.
Bye.